A Korean mafia boss went to buy a wedding ring for a grave. On his way, he saw a
Please, I
woman
need
holding
help.
a
Take my
sign that said
baby.
$15.
What? Are you serious? You
Take my
can't do
baby.
that?
When he looked closer, his blood ran
Please,
cold.
I need help.
That
Take
baby
my
had his eyes. And the
What?
woman
Are
holding
you
her was the
serious?
same
You
woman
can't
who'd saved
do
his life a
that?
year ago and disappeared without a trace. Hi, welcome in. This is a story that'll make you question everything you think you know about fate, responsibility, and the price of survival. I'm going to tell you about a woman who had everything and lost it all in 72 hours. About a man whose power couldn't protect the one person he loved. And about a baby who became the bridge between two broken souls who thought they'd never see each other again. Let me just say this up front. A Korean mafia boss went to buy a wedding ring for a grave. On his way, he saw a woman holding a sign that said $15, take my baby. When he looked closer, his blood ran cold. That baby had his eyes. And the woman holding her was the same woman who'd saved his life a year ago and disappeared without a trace. This isn't just a story about coincidence. It's about the invisible threads that connect us to people we think we'll never see again. It's about what happens when desperation meets responsibility, when shame meets recognition, and when two people who survived their own separate hells suddenly have to face each other in the most devastating way possible. Before we get to that street corner, before we get to the moment everything changes, I need you to understand how they both got there. Because this story doesn't start with a cardboard sign. It starts with betrayal, with loss, and with one night when two strangers saved each other without even knowing it. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 10,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Let's begin. You can smell desperation the way you can smell rain before it falls. Something heavy hanging in the air. Something inevitable. Something that makes your skin prickle with the knowledge that everything is about to change, even if you don't want it to. Chioma Obi stood on the corner of 5th and Madison with a piece of cardboard in her trembling hands. She'd made the sign that morning using a Sharpie she'd stolen from a convenience store, her hands shaking so badly the letters came out uneven. Some of them were bleeding where her tears had smudged the marker before the ink could dry. The message was simple, brutal, impossible to misunderstand. $15. Take my baby. Elena slept against her chest, 1 year old, warm and trusting in a way that made Chioma's shame burn hotter than the cold November wind cutting through her threadbare jacket. The baby's weight felt both familiar and foreign, like carrying proof of every mistake she'd ever made wrapped in a pink onesie that was too small now, the sleeves riding up on Elena's tiny wrists because Chioma couldn't afford to buy new clothes. The city moved around them with practiced indifference. Car horns blaring in that aggressive rhythm that said get out of my way, I have places to be, your problems are not my problems. Distant sirens wailing like the city itself was crying. The mechanical whir of traffic that never quite stops, even when your world has completely fallen apart. Even when you're standing on a corner trying to sell your child for less than the cost of a pizza. Nobody looked directly at them. That was the thing Chioma had learned about being invisible. People had mastered the art of seeing without seeing, acknowledging without engaging. Their eyes would land on her for half a second, process the image of a young black woman with a baby and a sign, and then slide away like oil on water. Like if they didn't make eye contact, they wouldn't have to feel anything about what they were witnessing. A businessman in a pressed suit glanced over, his face doing that quick calculation that said I see you, I pity you, I'm not stopping, I have a meeting. His shoes probably cost more than Chioma used to make in a week, back when she had a job, back when she was a person instead of a problem. He walked faster, pulling his phone out like suddenly he had an urgent call to make, anything to avoid the uncomfortable reality of a woman selling her baby on a Tuesday afternoon. A woman with shopping bags from expensive stores crossed the street early to avoid them. She had that look, that tight-lipped expression that said I give to charity, I'm a good person, but I don't give to people like you on street corners because how do I know you're not scamming me? The bag swung from her arms, full of things she probably didn't need, bought with money she probably didn't think about, while Chioma stood there with a baby she loved more than breathing and no idea how to feed her tonight. A teenager took a picture. Didn't ask permission, didn't offer help, just lifted his phone and captured Chioma's worst moment like it was content. Probably for social media. Probably with a caption about how sad the world had become, how someone should do something, as if observation was the same thing as compassion. As if posting about poverty was the same thing as fighting it. As if clicking share was the same thing as caring. Chioma's feet hurt in a way that went beyond physical pain. The pavement was cold through the worn soles of her shoes that used to be expensive before she'd walked them into the ground looking for work that never came. She'd bought them 3 years ago, back when she had a salary and an office and a future. They'd been cream-colored once, soft leather with a modest heel that said professional but not trying too hard. Now they were gray with street grime, the heels worn down to nubs, one of them splitting along the side where the sole was separating from the upper. Her jacket had holes in both elbows. Not the fashionable kind, not the artfully distressed look that people paid extra for in boutiques. The kind that said this person has run out of options, this person has been wearing the same clothes for months, this person is hanging on by a thread and that thread is fraying fast. How did I get here, she thought, but she knew. She knew exactly how. The path from corner office to street corner wasn't as long as people wanted to believe. It was just a series of doors closing, one after another, each one slamming a little bit harder, until you were standing outside in the cold with nowhere left to go and no one left to call. If you're wondering how a mother could hold that sign, if you're judging her right now, if you're thinking I would never, I'd find another way, I need you to understand something. Desperation doesn't ask for your approval. It doesn't care about your moral high ground or your theories about what you'd do in that situation. When you've been hungry for days and your child is crying and every single system designed to help you has failed, when the shelters are full and the food pantries are empty and the job applications go into a void and nobody calls you back, you start thinking about the unthinkable. You start measuring the value of dignity against the weight of survival. You start doing math in your head that makes you hate yourself. $15 would buy formula. Maybe diapers. Maybe a hot meal that she could eat half of and save half for tomorrow. $15 was more than she had in her pocket right now, which was nothing. Less than nothing, actually, because she owed money to people who'd stopped being patient about a month ago. And sometimes, when you're standing on that corner with your baby and your sign and your shame, survival wins. It just wins. Not because you're weak, but because you're human, and humans break when you push them hard enough. When you apply enough pressure to enough points, something has to give. For Chioma, what gave was the belief that she could do this alone, that she could somehow pull herself up by bootstraps she didn't even have anymore. Elena stirred against her chest, making that little sound she made when she was about to wake up. A soft mewling like a kitten. Chioma bounced gently, automatically, her body knowing what to do even when her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere dark. Somewhere that whispered maybe someone would take her, someone who could feed her, someone who could give her the life I can't. The thought made her stomach twist. Made her want to throw up. Made her want to run, but where would she run to? The shelter wouldn't take them back after last night, after Elena had cried for hours and the other mothers had complained and the supervisor had pulled Chioma aside and said in that tone that was supposed to sound sympathetic but just sounded tired, maybe you should try the one across town, maybe they have space, maybe. There was no space. There was never space. The city was full of people like her, people who'd fallen through the cracks, and the cracks were getting wider every day while the safety net got smaller. But what Chioma didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she stood there with tears streaming down her face and her baby stirring awake and her heart breaking into pieces so small she'd never be able to put them back together, was that 3 blocks away, a black luxury sedan was pulling up to a jewelry store. And inside that car was the one person in the world who could change everything. The one person who owed her a debt he didn't even remember. The one person whose life she'd saved without ever knowing his name. 3 years earlier, Chioma's life had looked completely different. Not better in every way, maybe. There had still been stress, still been pressure, still been that nagging voice in her head that said you're not doing enough, you're not being enough. But it had been stable. Predictable. Safe. And safety, Chioma had learned the hard way, was worth more than she'd ever given it credit for. She'd worked as a senior project manager at Okafor Industries, one of those mid-sized corporate entities that promised growth and delivered paperwork. The kind of place where people wore business casual and pretended the coffee wasn't terrible and sent emails that could have been text messages. Her office had been on the third floor, not quite important enough for executive level, but high enough that she could look out the window and see something other than the parking lot. Her desk had been covered in the usual office detritus. A coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Employee," a gift from a coworker who thought they were funnier than they were. A framed photo of her and her fiancé at some company event, both of them smiling like they meant it. A succulent in a small pot because someone had told her plants improved air quality and reduced stress. The succulent had died within 2 months. She should have taken that as a sign, but hindsight is cruel that way. It shows you all the warnings you missed when you were too busy moving forward to look down. Her boss was named David. David Okafor, son of the founder, heir to a moderately successful import business that dealt in electronics and furniture and whatever else turned a profit that quarter. He was 34, handsome in that generic way that came from good genes and expensive haircuts, confident in that way that came from never having to worry about money or consequences or what people really thought of him. And he was her fiancé. That last part was important. That last part was the thing that made everything complicated, that blurred all the lines that were supposed to stay clear. They'd met at work, obviously. She'd been there 6 months when he'd noticed her, or claimed to notice her, though later she'd wonder if he'd been watching longer than that. He'd asked her to dinner under the guise of discussing a project, and she'd gone because saying no to your boss's son felt like career suicide. That first dinner had turned into a second, then a third, and somewhere around the 5th dinner he'd kissed her in the parking lot and she'd let him because it felt nice to be wanted by someone who had power, someone who could make her life easier or harder depending on his mood. They'd been together for 2 years when he proposed. Nothing fancy, nothing that would end up as a viral video or a story she'd tell her grandchildren. Just dinner at an expensive restaurant where the portions were small and the wine list was intimidating and the other diners spoke in hushed tones like they were in a library instead of eating overpriced fish. He'd gotten down on one knee between the appetizer and the main course, the timing slightly off like he'd planned it, but then forgotten and had to improvise. The ring had been beautiful though, she'd give him that. A princess-cut diamond that caught the light like it was showing off, set in platinum with smaller stones along the band. She'd said yes because saying no would have meant finding a new job, a new apartment, a new future all at once. She'd said yes because she was 28 and her mother kept making comments about biological clocks. She'd said yes because it seemed like the next logical step, the thing you were supposed to do when you've been dating someone for 2 years and worked at the same company and had already met each other's families. She'd said yes, and she'd meant it, or told herself she meant it, which was almost the same thing. The ring had been beautiful. She'd spent hours looking at it, twisting it on her finger during meetings, catching the light and watching it sparkle, imagining the wedding. White dress with a long train. Flower arrangements that matched the color scheme. Her mother finally proud of her for once. Her father walking her down an aisle, maybe crying a little. Normal things. The kind of things that made you feel like you'd done life correctly, like you'd followed the script and gotten the reward you were promised. She'd picked out a venue. An old hotel with high ceilings and chandeliers and that kind of faded elegance that photographs well. She'd sent invitations with gold lettering and her and David's names printed in a font that was supposed to look classic. She'd chosen centerpieces that matched the color scheme she'd obsessed over for months, dusty rose and sage green because Pinterest had told her those colors were timeless. Everything was planned down to the minute. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly how it was supposed to be. Until 5 days before the wedding, David came home early from work with that look on his face. The look that said, "I've already made a decision and I'm just here to tell you about it." The look that said this conversation is a formality, not a discussion. And that's when Chioma's carefully constructed future started to crumble. But before we see how it fell apart, before we watch her lose everything she'd built, I need to tell you about the man in the black car. Because his story was falling apart too, just in a completely different way. And soon, very soon, these two broken stories would crash into each other in a way that neither of them could have predicted. The club had been too loud, the drinks too strong, the pain too immediate. Chioma had gone there to forget, to drown in bass drops and strangers' faces and anything that wasn't the empty apartment where she'd been living alone for 3 days. David had broken up with her. Just like that. 5 days before the wedding, he'd walked into their shared apartment and said, "I can't do this. I'm sorry, it's not you, it's me." All the cliches that people use when they want to feel better about the hurt they're causing. Except it wasn't just "I can't do this." It was "I'm marrying Mina instead." Mina. His childhood friend. The one he'd mentioned exactly 3 times in 2 years, always in that wistful way that should have been a red flag. The one who'd moved to London for work and apparently just moved back. The one who understands me in a way you never did. Those had been his exact words, and they'd cut deeper than the breakup itself because they meant Chioma hadn't just lost him. She'd never really had him in the first place. So she'd gone to the club. Put on the tightest dress she owned and the highest heels and makeup that made her look like someone else, someone who wasn't falling apart. She drunk tequila shots that burned going down and ordered drinks with names she didn't recognize and let the music wash over her until she couldn't think anymore, couldn't feel anything except the bass vibrating in her chest. That's where she'd met him. He'd been sitting alone in the VIP section, which was really just a roped-off area with slightly nicer couches and bottle service. Korean tall, with tattoos creeping up his neck and disappearing under his collar. His face was beautiful in a dangerous way, sharp angles and dark eyes that looked like they'd seen things that would give normal people nightmares. He'd been nursing a drink and staring at nothing, and something about the emptiness in his expression had matched the emptiness she felt. She'd been about to order another drink she didn't need when she'd noticed he was bleeding. Not badly, but definitely bleeding. A gash on his forearm, dark blood seeping through his white shirt sleeve, staining the expensive fabric. Chioma had frozen. Drunk enough to be reckless but not drunk enough to ignore obvious danger. She should have walked away. Should have minded her business. Should have done literally anything except what she did, which was walk over to him. "You're bleeding," she'd said, because apparently tequila made her state the obvious. He'd looked up at her, his eyes focusing slowly like he was coming back from somewhere far away. "It's nothing. It's not nothing. You need to get that looked at." That's when she'd heard them. Voices in the crowd, loud and aggressive. Korean words she didn't understand but recognized the tone of. Threats. Someone looking for someone. The man's entire body had tensed. His hand had moved to his side, and Chioma had realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he had a gun tucked into his waistband. "Please," he'd said, switching to English with a heavy accent. "Don't tell them I'm here." 3 men had been pushing through the crowd, scanning faces. Looking for him, obviously looking for him. Chioma had made a decision in a split second, the kind of decision that seems insane later but feels necessary in the moment. She grabbed his arm and pulled him behind the heavy velvet curtains that separated the VIP section from the back hallway. Pressed against him in the dark, barely breathing, while the men walked past. She'd felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt the heat of his skin, felt the gun pressing against her hip through his jacket. The men had swept through the club. She'd heard them questioning the bartender, heard furniture being moved, heard someone cursing. And then, finally, they'd left. When she'd emerged from behind the curtain, the man had been looking at her with something between gratitude and confusion. "Why did you do that?" he'd asked. She'd shrugged, still drunk, still numb, still running from her own problems. "Because you looked like you needed help. And I needed to feel like I could still do something right today." His name was Chun Min Jae, though she wouldn't learn that until much later. That night, they were just 2 broken people who'd shared a moment of danger. He'd bought her drinks to say thank you. She'd drunk them because going home to an empty apartment felt impossible. They'd talked or tried to, his English broken and her Korean non-existent, but somehow they'd communicated the important things. That they were both running from something. That they'd both lost people they loved. That sometimes the only way to survive grief was to share it with a stranger who wouldn't judge you for falling apart. She didn't remember making the decision to leave with him. Didn't remember the cab ride to the hotel or how they'd gotten upstairs. But she remembered the way he touched her, gentle despite the violence he clearly carried with him. Remembered the way they'd held each other like drowning people holding onto wreckage. Remembered falling asleep wrapped in sheets that smelled like expensive detergent and waking up alone. He'd been gone in the morning. No note, no number, no trace that he'd ever been there except the imprint in the pillow next to hers. She'd felt stupid for expecting anything different. Stupid for hoping that maybe this random encounter meant something. She'd gone home, showered away the night, and tried to move on with the messy work of rebuilding her life. 4 weeks later, she'd missed her period. And that's when everything got so much worse. Chioma had stared at the pregnancy test for a full 10 minutes, watching the 2 pink lines like they might disappear if she looked at them long enough. They didn't disappear. They just sat there, bold and undeniable, mocking her for thinking her life couldn't possibly get any worse. She was pregnant. Pregnant from a one-night stand with a stranger whose name she didn't know, whose face she could barely remember through the tequila haze. Pregnant when she'd just been dumped 5 days before her wedding. Pregnant when she was emotionally and financially unprepared for literally anything, let alone a baby. She'd cried in the bathroom of her new apartment, the tiny studio she'd moved into after David had so generously let her keep her job, but asked her to move out of their shared place because Mina was moving in. She'd cried until her face was swollen and her throat hurt and she'd run out of tears. Then she'd pulled herself together, washed her face, and tried to figure out what to do. She couldn't keep it. That had been her first thought. She had no money saved, a job that barely covered her new rent, no partner, no support system. She'd made an appointment at a clinic, sat in the waiting room with the paperwork in her lap, and stared at the wall for 20 minutes before walking out. She couldn't explain why. Some combination of fear and hope and that voice in her head that said maybe this is your chance at something that's actually yours, something that won't leave you. She'd been 4 months along, just starting to show, when David had called her into his office. "Chioma, we need to talk," he'd said, and her stomach had dropped because she knew that tone. That was his "I'm about to make your life difficult" tone. She'd sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she'd sat in dozens of times for project meetings, and waited. "I've been thinking," he'd said, leaning back in his expensive ergonomic office chair. "About us. About everything that happened." "Okay," she'd said carefully. "I made a mistake. I realize that now. Mina and I, it's not what I thought it would be. She's too demanding, too clingy. I miss what we had. I miss you." Chioma had felt something stir in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or just the desperate need to not be alone in this. "I want to try again," he'd continued. "I want us to get married. Maybe not right away, but soon. We can start over. I can make this right." She should have said no. Should have told him to go to hell. Should have stood up and walked out with her dignity intact. But she was 4 months pregnant with nowhere to turn and no one to call, and he was offering her a life raft. So she'd said yes. Yes, with conditions she didn't say out loud. Yes, with a desperate hope that maybe she could hide the pregnancy long enough to figure something out. Yes, because hope, even false hope, felt better than the alternative. For 2 months, she'd worn loose clothing. Had avoided him touching her stomach. Had made excuses about why she couldn't meet his family yet. Had prayed that somehow, miraculously, this would work out. It hadn't worked out. He'd found the ultrasound photo in her purse. She'd been 6 months pregnant by then, undeniably showing despite the baggy clothes. She'd come back from lunch to find him in the break room, holding the black and white image of her baby, his face twisted with rage. "You're pregnant," he'd said. Not a question. An accusation. "Yes," she'd started to say, her voice shaking. "I can explain." "Who's the father?" "I don't know. It was before we got back together. It was a mistake." "Please, David, just let me explain." But he hadn't let her explain. Hadn't wanted to hear about the club or the grief for the night that had felt like survival and ended up being a different kind of disaster. He just looked at her with disgust and said, "Get out." Security had escorted her from the building that afternoon. She'd cleaned out her desk while people watched, whispered, judged. Had handed in her badge and her laptop and her keys. Had walked out onto the street with a cardboard box of personal items and nowhere to go. He'd called her that night. Not to apologize. To tell her he was keeping the security deposit on their old apartment because she damaged the hardwood floors, which was a lie. To tell her he was reporting her to their professional network for inappropriate workplace behavior, which was rich coming from him. To tell her, essentially, that he was going to make sure she never worked in this industry again. And he'd kept that promise. Every job application she submitted got no response. Every reference she listed mysteriously had nothing good to say. Every interview that seemed promising ended with "sorry, we're going in a different direction." 7 months pregnant, she'd given birth to Elena in a charity hospital where the lights were too bright and the nurses were overworked and kind in that exhausted way of people who see too much suffering. She'd held her baby girl and cried because Elena was perfect, absolutely perfect, and she had no idea how to take care of her. That was a year ago. And every day since then had been a lesson in how quickly you can fall when there's no one to catch you. Elena's first year of life had been a masterclass in survival. Not the inspirational kind that gets made into movies. The brutal kind that leaves scars you can't see. Chioma had tried everything. She'd applied to 57 different jobs in the first 3 months after Elena was born. She'd kept a list, checking it obsessively, refreshing her email every 5 minutes waiting for responses that never came. She'd been a project manager with 5 years of experience and glowing reviews, but none of that mattered when her most recent employer was David Okafor and his recommendation consisted of silence. The money had run out fast. Faster than she'd thought possible. Her savings had been modest to begin with, not enough to cover first and last month's rent on a new place, and babies were expensive in ways she'd never imagined. Formula. Diapers. Doctor's visits. The costs added up like water rising in a sinking ship, and she'd bailed as fast as she could, but it wasn't enough. She'd lost her apartment after 3 months. The landlord had been sympathetic at first, then firm, then legally required to evict her. She'd moved to a shelter, one of those places that smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation, where families slept in rows of cots and you had to be out by 7 in the morning and back by 6 in the evening or you lost your spot. The shelter had rules. No crying babies after 10 p.m. No taking up more than your allotted space. No complaining about the food or the conditions or the fact that you were sharing a bathroom with 40 other people. Chioma had tried to follow them all. Had walked the streets during the day with Elena in a carrier, going to the library for warmth, to parks when the weather was nice, to coffee shops where she'd nurse a single cup of tea for hours pretending she had somewhere to be. Her family had stopped answering her calls after the first month. Her mother had said, "I warned you about getting involved with your boss," as if she'd predicted this exact scenario. Her father had said, "You made your bed, now lie in it," as if she'd chosen to get pregnant and abandoned and homeless. Her siblings had their own lives, their own problems, their own reasons for not wanting to be associated with someone who'd fallen so far so fast. Friends became ghosts. The ones she'd had at work disappeared when she was fired. The ones from before, college friends and high school acquaintances, drifted away when her social media posts went from brunch photos to desperate requests for job leads. People had a limited tolerance for other people's suffering, she'd learned. They'd say, "I'm here for you," and mean it, until being there required actual effort. Elena had gotten sick at 7 months old. A fever that spiked to 103 degrees. Chioma had taken her to the emergency room, had waited for 6 hours in a plastic chair while her baby cried and burned. The doctors had been kind but rushed. It was just a virus, they'd said. Keep her hydrated. Give her infant acetaminophen. Bring her back if it gets worse. The bill had been $800. Chioma had stared at it and laughed, actually laughed, because what was $800 when you had $7 in your bank account? What did debt matter when you were already drowning? She'd tried temp agencies. They'd said they'd call. They hadn't called. She'd tried retail. They'd said they were looking for someone with more availability, which was code for someone without a baby. She'd tried everything she could think of, and every door had closed in her face. The shelter had kicked them out after Elena had cried through the night one too many times. The supervisor had been apologetic but firm. "We have other families to think about," she'd said. "Maybe try the one across town." The one across town had been full. So had the one after that. And the one after that. They'd started sleeping in the library bathroom. It was cleaner than the street, warmer than the park benches, and if Chioma got there early enough in the morning, she could clean them both up before anyone noticed. She'd gotten good at being invisible. At moving through spaces without drawing attention. At making herself and Elena small enough to fit into the cracks of a city that had no room for them. Food pantries had lines that wrapped around blocks. Churches gave out meals, but only at certain times, and if you were late you were out of luck. Chioma had learned to time their days around food, around warmth, around the basic necessities of keeping Elena alive and herself functional enough to keep trying. Elena's first birthday had passed in that library bathroom. Chioma had sung happy birthday in a whisper, had cried while Elena played with a toy someone had left behind, had promised her daughter that things would get better even though she didn't believe it anymore. That was 3 days ago. And this morning, staring at her daughter's face, hollow-cheeked and too thin despite Chioma giving her every bite of food they managed to get, something in Chioma had broken. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just a quiet snap. Like a thread pulled too tight for too long. She'd thought this is no life for her. She deserves better than this. Better than a mother who can't feed her, can't house her, can't do anything except love her and drag her deeper into poverty. The sign had been a last resort. A desperate attempt to give Elena what Chioma couldn't. A life. Any life. Any life but this one. And that's how she'd ended up on the corner of 5th and Madison, holding a piece of cardboard and hating herself more than she'd thought was possible to hate another human being. Chun Min-jae adjusted the cuffs of his silver suit jacket as his driver navigated through downtown traffic. The suit was custom-tailored, Italian silk with hand-stitched details that most people wouldn't notice, but that cost more than what some families made in 6 months. His watch was Swiss, complicated enough that it showed the time in 3 time zones and the phases of the moon. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He looked like success. Looked like power. Looked like a man who had everything under control. He felt like he was drowning. The ring box sat heavy in his pocket. White gold with a princess-cut diamond. 3 carats, flawless clarity. Beautiful and utterly meaningless now. He'd commissioned it 3 years ago, right before Ji-woo died, planning to propose on her birthday. The ring had sat in his safe ever since, a symbol of a future that had been stolen from him. Today he was finally going to do something with it. Not propose, obviously. Ji-woo was dead, killed by rivals who'd wanted to send him a message about overstepping boundaries. They'd succeeded. The message had been received loud and clear when he'd found her body in their apartment, and he'd responded by systematically destroying everyone involved until there was no one left to destroy. But the ring had stayed in his safe. A reminder. A guilt. A what if. He decided this morning, on what would have been their 5th anniversary, to bury it with her. To finally let go of the ghost he'd been carrying. To maybe possibly, try to move on with some kind of life that didn't revolve entirely around violence and revenge and the gaping hole where his heart used to be. The jewelry store was in the Diamond District, surrounded by other expensive shops selling expensive things to expensive people. His driver pulled up to the curb, and Chun prepared to step out, to go inside and have the ring engraved with something meaningful, something that would matter only to him and the grave he'd visit later today. "Boss," his bodyguard said suddenly from the front seat. His name was Han, mid-30s, loyal to a fault, had been with Chun for 7 years. "Boss, look." Chun followed his gaze to the street corner across from them. At first he didn't understand what he was looking at. A woman. A baby. Some kind of sign. Nothing unusual in a city full of desperate people. Then his brain processed the words on the sign. $15. Take my baby. His stomach twisted. He'd seen a lot of terrible things in his line of work. Had done a lot of terrible things. But there was something about the raw desperation of that sign that cut through his carefully maintained armor. "Boss," Han said again, his voice strange. Boss, that baby. Look at her face. Chun looked. The baby was sleeping, her face visible despite being pressed against the woman's chest. Dark hair. Olive skin. Features that looked familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. Features that looked like his. He stared at the baby, his mind racing through possibilities and impossibilities. It couldn't be. The chances were astronomical. But the longer he looked, the more certain he became. That baby looked exactly like his baby pictures, the ones his mother had kept in albums that he'd looked through exactly once and then never again because seeing himself that young and innocent felt like looking at a stranger. And the woman. Something about her was familiar too. Chun couldn't place it at first, his mind flipping through faces and encounters trying to match her to someone he knew. Then it hit him like a physical blow. The club. A year ago. The night he'd been running from Park's men after a deal had gone bad. He'd been shot, bleeding, cornered in a VIP section, and a woman had hidden him. Had pulled him behind a curtain and stood in front of the assassins and played drunk convincingly enough that they'd moved on. He'd bought her drinks to say thank you. They'd talked, though he barely remembered what about. Then they'd gone to a hotel room, and he'd left before she woke up because getting attached to people got them killed, as Ji-woo had proven so definitively. That woman. The one on the corner holding the sign. That was her. And the baby with his eyes and his nose and his chin was wearing a pink onesie and sleeping against her chest, completely unaware that her mother was trying to sell her for the price of a cheap meal. Drive across the street, Chun said, his voice coming out harder than he intended. Now. Boss, are you sure? Now. The car pulled a U-turn, cutting off traffic, drawing angry honks that Chun ignored. They pulled up to the curb beside the woman, and Chun was out of the car before it had fully stopped moving. He crossed the sidewalk in 3 strides, his bodyguards flanking him automatically, creating a perimeter that made passers-by give them a wide berth. The woman looked up as he approached, her face doing something complicated. Recognition, then fear, then shame, then disbelief, cycling through emotion so fast he couldn't track them all. You, she whispered, and her voice was hoarse like she'd been crying. Like she'd been crying for a long time. Chun stopped in front of her, close enough to read every detail. The exhaustion in her face. The hopelessness in her eyes. The way she was holding the baby, protective even now, even while holding a sign that offered to give her away. He knelt. Right there on the dirty sidewalk, ignoring the expensive fabric of his pants, ignoring his bodyguard's confused looks, and read the sign up close. $15. She was selling their daughter for $15. You saved my life, he said quietly, the words coming out in English that felt clumsy on his tongue. That night. The club. You hid me from the men who would have killed me. She just stared at him, tears streaming down her face. I looked for you, he continued. After. I wanted to say thank you. To repay you. But you were gone. I didn't know your name. Didn't know how to find you. He looked at the baby, his daughter, sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest. Reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her tiny hand. Her fingers wrapped around his reflexively, that instinct babies have to hold on to things, to hold on to anyone who reaches for them. What's her name? He asked. Elena, the woman whispered. Her name is Elena. Elena, he repeated, testing it out. Then he looked back up at the woman, at Chioma, though he didn't know her name yet. And you're selling our daughter for $15. Chioma couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't process the fact that the man from that night, the dangerous beautiful man who disappeared before dawn, was kneeling in front of her on a city sidewalk looking at their daughter like his entire world had just shifted on its axis. I didn't know, she managed to say through the tears. I didn't know how to find you. I didn't even know your name. Chun Min-jae, he said. My name is Chun Min-jae. Chioma, she whispered back. Chioma Obi. They stared at each other, Two people who'd shared one desperate night and created a life without meaning to, without planning to, without even exchanging contact information. Two people who'd been broken in different ways and had tried to fix themselves with each other's bodies and had only created more complications. The sign, Chun said, still looking at Elena. Why? And something in the way he asked, not judgmental, just genuinely confused, like he couldn't understand how anyone could get to this point, broke something loose in Chioma. The words came pouring out like a flood breaking through a dam. She told him everything. About David, her fiancé who'd left her for his childhood friend 5 days before their wedding. About going to the club that night to forget, to feel anything other than abandoned. About finding out she was pregnant weeks later. About David taking her back, then destroying her when he found out about the baby. About losing her job, her apartment, her savings. About the shelters that kicked them out and the food pantries with lines too long and the job applications that went nowhere. About the year of watching her daughter get thinner and quieter while Chioma ran out of options and hope and reasons to believe things would get better. About this morning, when she'd looked at Elena and thought maybe someone else could give her a better life. Maybe anyone else. Maybe a stranger with $15 and hopefully more love than Chioma had strength left to give. I just wanted her to survive, she finished, her voice breaking. I just wanted her to have a chance. Even if it meant I didn't get to be her mother anymore. Chun listened to all of it without interrupting. His jaw had gotten tighter with every revelation, his hands curling into fists at his sides. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where is he?" "Who?" "The man who did this. Who took everything from you. Where is he?" Chioma shook her head. "It doesn't matter. What's done is done." "It matters," Chun said, and his voice had taken on an edge that reminded her that he was dangerous, that he'd been running from assassins that night, that his world was not her world and the rules were different there. "It matters very much. But we'll deal with that later." He stood up, his hand still touching Elena's fingers, and looked at Chioma with something she couldn't quite name. Not pity. Not sympathy. Something harder and more honest. "You saved my life that night," he said. "I owe you a debt. In my world, debts are not taken lightly. They are absolute. They are sacred. You gave me my life. I was bleeding, cornered, dead if you hadn't intervened. And you didn't just hide me. You risked yourself. Those men would have killed you too if they'd known." "It was nothing," Chioma started to say, but he cut her off. "It was everything. And now I find out that not only did you save my life, but you've been carrying my daughter for a year. Alone. Suffering. While I had no idea she even existed." He looked at Elena again, and Chioma saw something shift in his expression. Saw him making calculations, coming to decisions, the way powerful people do when they've decided to rearrange the world to fit their needs. "This is what's going to happen," he said. "You're not selling our daughter. Not for $15. Not for $15 million. She's ours. Yours and mine. And I'm going to fix this." "You can't just fix this," Chioma said, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. "You can't just throw money at poverty and make it go away. This isn't your world where problems disappear because you say so." "You're right," he said. "Money doesn't fix everything. But it fixes a lot. And what it doesn't fix, I will fix other ways." He pulled out his phone, made a call in Korean that Chioma couldn't understand. Gave orders that sounded absolute. When he hung up, he looked at her again. "You're coming with me," he said. "Both of you. You're going to tell me everything about the past year. Every detail. Every person who turned you away. Every system that failed you. And then we're going to start fixing it." "I don't want your charity," Chioma said, even though she knew she was in no position to refuse anything. "This isn't charity," Chun said. "This is debt. You saved my life. You gave me a daughter I didn't know existed. I owe you everything. Let me start by giving you back your dignity." He held out his hand. Chioma looked at it. Looked at him. looked at the black car waiting at the curb and the bodyguard standing at attention, and the jewelry store across the street where he'd been heading before his life had intersected with hers again. She looked at Elena, still sleeping, still trusting, still unaware that everything was about to change. Then she took his hand. The car was warm. That was the first thing Chioma noticed. Actually warm, with heated leather seats and climate control, and that new car smell that spoke of money and comfort and a world so different from hers that it might as well have been a different planet. Elena had woken up as soon as they'd gotten inside, her eyes going wide at the unfamiliar surroundings. She'd looked at Chun with curiosity but no fear, that way babies do when they don't yet understand danger. Chun had looked back at her with something Chioma couldn't quite name. Wonder, maybe. Or terror. Or both. The driver hadn't asked questions. Neither had the bodyguards. They'd just gotten in the car and driven, following whatever orders Chun had given, and now they were heading somewhere unknown while Chioma sat in a leather seat holding her daughter and trying to process what was happening. "Tell me everything," Chun said. "Start from the beginning. Before the club. Before me. I want to understand how you got to that corner." So Chioma told him. Told him about David in more detail. About the wedding that never happened, about the job she'd lost and the revenge she'd taken when she tried to move on. Told him about the pregnancy, about hiding it, about the moment David had found the ultrasound and everything had ended. Told him about the birth, about Elena coming into the world in a charity hospital where the lights were too bright and the nurses were too tired. Told him about the year that followed. The endless job applications. The shelters. The food pantries. The library bathroom where they'd been sleeping. The moment this morning when she'd looked at her daughter and thought, "I can't do this anymore." Thought maybe Elena deserved a mother who could actually take care of her instead of one who loved her desperately but couldn't keep her fed. "I kept trying," Chioma said, her voice shaking. "I tried so hard. But everything just kept getting worse. Every door closed. Every person turned away. And I thought, what if someone with $15 has more to offer her than I do? What if any life is better than this one?" Chun had listened without interrupting, his expression getting darker with every revelation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The man who did this," he finally said. "David. Give me his full name. His address. Everything you know about him." "Why?" "Because," Chun said, and his voice was cold in a way that made Chioma remember he was dangerous. "He's going to pay for what he did to you. To both of you." "That won't change anything," Chioma said. "That won't give me back the year I lost. Won't give Elena back the stability she should have had." "No," Chun agreed. "But it will make sure he never does this to anyone else. And it will send a message that there are consequences for destroying people's lives." Chioma looked at him, this man she barely knew, who was offering her violence disguised as justice. Part of her wanted to say yes. Wanted to watch David suffer the way she'd suffered. But another part, the part that was so tired of fighting, just wanted to move forward. "I don't want revenge," she said quietly. "I just want my daughter to be okay. I want to be able to feed her without having to beg. I want to sleep somewhere that isn't a bathroom floor. I want to wake up without wondering if today's the day I completely fail her." Chun nodded slowly. "Okay. No revenge. Not yet, anyway. But you need to let me help you." The car pulled up to a building. Expensive looking. Glass and steel and doormen in uniforms. The kind of place Chioma used to walk past and wonder what it was like inside. "Where are we?" she asked. "My building," Chun said. "I have an apartment on the top floor. Empty, since I mostly live at my other property. You and Elena are going to stay there." "I can't." "You can," he interrupted. "And you will. This isn't negotiable, Chioma. You're not sleeping in a library bathroom anymore. You're not standing on street corners with signs. That's done." "I don't want your charity," Chioma repeated, even though she knew how ridiculous it sounded given her situation. "This isn't charity," Chun said again, more firmly this time. "This is me taking responsibility. That's my daughter. That's my child who's been suffering because I didn't know she existed. You think I'm going to let her keep suffering now that I do know? You think my pride is worth more than her well-being? Chioma looked at Elena, who was staring at Chun with those wide dark eyes that looked exactly like his. Looked at this man who'd been a stranger, then a one-night stand, then a ghost, and was now offering to be something else entirely. What do you want from me? She asked quietly. In exchange for all this. What's the price? No price, Chun said. Just the truth. Just let me be in her life. Let me be her father. I don't know how to do that. Don't know if I'll be any good at it. But I want to try. And I want to help you, because you deserve help. Because you saved my life and you've been drowning while I had no idea. He looked at her directly, his eyes intense. Let me save yours. Let me give you both the life you should have had all along. Chioma felt tears starting again, but different tears this time. Not despair. Something closer to hope, fragile and uncertain but real. Okay, she whispered. Okay. The apartment was more than Chioma had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Modern furniture that looked like it belonged in magazines. A kitchen with appliances she didn't know how to use. 2 bedrooms, both bigger than the entire studio she'd lost a year ago. A bathroom with a tub large enough for swimming. Everything clean and untouched and impossibly far from the street corner where she'd been standing 3 hours ago. Elena was asleep in her arms, exhausted from the day's events. Chun had ordered food to be delivered, real food, not donated food or food pantry food but restaurant food that came in nice containers with garnishes and side dishes. Chioma had eaten until she felt sick, her stomach unused to abundance after months of scarcity. Now they stood in the living room while the bodyguards waited outside and the city sparkled below them and everything felt surreal. I need to tell you something, Chun said. About why I was buying the ring today. Chioma waited. I had a fiancée. Ji-woo. She was killed 3 years ago by people who wanted to hurt me. The ring was for her. I was going to propose on her birthday, but she died before I got the chance. I'm sorry, Chioma said. I kept the ring, Chun continued. Couldn't bring myself to return it or sell it or do anything with it. So it just sat in my safe, this symbol of a future that never happened. Today was our anniversary. Would have been anyway. I decided to finally bury it with her. To let go. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring box. Opened it to show her the diamond inside, sparkling even in the dim apartment lighting. But I don't think that's what it's for anymore, he said. I think maybe this was meant for something else. Someone else. He looked at Chioma. I'm not asking you to marry me. We barely know each other. You've been through hell and I've been absent for all of it. But I am asking you to let me try. To build something with you. Not because of obligation or debt or guilt, but because we have a daughter together and because I want to be part of her life. Part of both your lives. I don't know what that looks like, Chioma said honestly. I don't know how to trust people anymore. Don't know how to believe in futures. That's fair, Chun said. So we'll take it slow. One day at a time. I'll help you get back on your feet. Find you a job if you want one, or support you if you'd rather focus on Elena. I'll make sure you have everything you need. And in exchange, you let me learn how to be a father. How to be someone worthy of that title. He closed the ring box and put it back in his pocket. This isn't a fairy tale, he said. I'm not a good man, Chioma. I've done terrible things. I live in a world full of violence and moral compromises. But I can be good to you and Elena. I can be better than I've been. If you'll let me. Chioma looked at Elena, sleeping peacefully in her arms. Looked at the apartment that was now theirs, at least for now. Looked at this man who'd appeared in her life twice now, both times when she'd needed saving, and who was offering her not a rescue but a partnership. One day at a time, she said. No promises. No obligations. Just see what happens. Chun nodded. One day at a time. The city glittered below them. The night was getting late. Elena stirred in her sleep, making small contented sounds. And for the first time in a year, Chioma felt something other than despair. Something fragile and new but undeniably real. Hope. Before you go, I want to leave you with something to think about. This story isn't really about a street corner or a sign or even about a reunion. It's about the invisible people in our cities, the ones we walk past without seeing. It's about how quickly anyone can fall when the system's designed to catch them fail. About how one bad break can cascade into 100 more. But it's also about something else. About the debts we owe to people who help us in our darkest moments. About taking responsibility even when it's inconvenient. About the difference between charity, which creates dependency, and restitution, which restores dignity. Chun didn't save Chioma because he felt sorry for her. He saved her because he owed her. Because she'd risked her life for a stranger and gotten nothing in return except a baby and a year of suffering. His response wasn't pity. It was honor. It was recognition that her survival mattered, that Elena's life mattered, that debts must be paid. We live in a world where people fall through cracks every day. Where a single mistake, a single betrayal, a single piece of bad luck can destroy everything you've built. Where women like Chioma end up on street corners with signs because every door has closed and every person has turned away. The question this story asks isn't whether people like Chioma deserve help. Of course they do. The question is whether people like us, like you, like me, are willing to give it. Not just with money, though money helps, but with recognition. With the willingness to see people as human beings instead of problems. With the understanding that anyone at all, can end up desperate given the wrong circumstances. Chioma wasn't weak. She'd fought for a year. She'd done everything right. And it hadn't been enough because sometimes the world is stacked against you in ways that individual effort can't overcome. Chun wasn't a hero. He was a criminal, morally compromised, steeped in violence. But he understood debt. Understood honor. Understood that when someone saves your life, you don't get to walk away and forget about them just because it's convenient. If this story made you think, made you feel something, made you look at the world a little differently, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see someone desperate on a street corner, don't look away. Don't judge. Just see them. See them as human. See them as someone who might have saved a stranger's life once and gotten nothing but suffering in return. Because that person could be anyone. Could be your neighbor. Could be your coworker. Could, under the wrong circumstances, be you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.